The helicopters ruled everything. For 7 years, they owned the sky over Afghanistan. The Mi-24 gunships came in low over the valleys, their rotors churning dust into clouds that swallowed entire villages. The Afghans below had nothing that could touch them. Rifles were useless. The few anti-aircraft guns they possessed were relics, slow and inaccurate. The pilots knew this. They flew with the confidence of men who understood they were untouchable. The Cold War didn't end. The files just went dark. Subscribe to Cold War Black Files to uncover them. Every document tells a story they never wanted you to hear. Subscribe. The war had settled into a rhythm by 1986. The Soviets controlled the cities and the major roads. The mujahideen controlled the mountains and the night. During the day, the helicopters were the deciding factor. They escorted convoys, destroyed supply routes, turned entire hillsides into burning rubble. A single Mi-24 could suppress an ambush that would otherwise cost dozens of Soviet lives. The pilots were not just soldiers. They were the instrument that made the occupation possible. Every morning at the Bagram airbase, the same ritual played out. Pilots gathered for briefings in concrete buildings that still smelled of diesel and stale cigarette smoke. Maps were spread across tables, flight paths traced with grease pencils. The missions were routine by now. Escort duty for supply convoys heading to Kabul. Reconnaissance sweeps over the Panjshir Valley. Close air support for troops pinned down in some nameless village. The pilots knew the terrain better than they knew the streets of their hometowns. They knew which valleys offered cover, which ridgelines the mujahideen preferred for ambushes, which roads were most likely to be mined. The Mi-24 was a beast of a machine. The Afghans called it the Devil's Chariot. It could carry 8 troops in its cargo bay while simultaneously mounting rocket pods, machine guns, and anti-tank missiles. Its armored cockpit could withstand heavy machine gun fire. Soviet doctrine built around it. The helicopter wasn't just for transport or reconnaissance. It was a flying infantry fighting vehicle, designed to deliver troops directly into combat while providing devastating fire support. In the open terrain of Afghanistan, where ambushes could come from any direction, the Mi-24 was the tool that let Soviet forces maintain the initiative. The pilots were proud. Most were career officers, men who'd trained for years to fly these machines. They'd survived the grueling flight schools, the endless drills, the political indoctrination that came with serving in the Soviet military. Afghanistan was supposed to be their proving ground. Some arrived believing in the mission, convinced they were defending socialism against American-backed insurgents. Others were more cynical, focused simply on doing their jobs and getting home alive. But all of them understood their value. They were the edge that kept the war from becoming an outright disaster. Then something changed. The first incident happened in September. A routine patrol over Jalalabad. 2 Mi-24s flying in formation, scanning for rebel positions below. The lead pilot was a major with over 400 combat hours. His wingman was younger, still new enough to the war that he double-checked his instruments obsessively. They were circling at 1,500 meters, low enough to spot movement on the ground, but high enough to be safe from small arms fire. One moment they were circling, the next there was a flash from the ground and the lead helicopter disintegrated. Not hit, disintegrated. The explosion was unlike anything the wingman had seen before. No black smoke, no struggling engine, no desperate radio calls. Just a white-hot flash and debris tumbling from the sky. He barely had time to process what he'd seen before his own aircraft shuddered and every alarm in the cockpit started screaming. The missile had struck his tail rotor. He went into a spin, fighting the controls as the ground rushed up. He managed to bring it down hard in a field, the landing gear collapsing on impact, the rotors tearing themselves apart as they struck the earth. The recovery team arrived within an hour. They secured the wreckage, loaded the stunned pilot into an armored personnel carrier, and tried to make sense of what had happened. The debris field told a story they didn't want to believe. The warhead had detonated perfectly, not near the aircraft but inside its engine exhaust. The shrapnel patterns were precise, designed specifically to destroy turbine blades and fuel lines. This wasn't a lucky shot from an old Soviet SA-7. This was something new. The pilots started talking. In the ready rooms, in the mess halls, over cigarettes outside the hangars in the cold mountain air. They'd all heard stories from Afghanistan before, tales of ambushes, of convoys disappearing into the mountains, of the brutality both sides inflicted on each other. Prisoners executed.
Village burned.
The kind of war where mercy was a weakness neither side could afford. But this was different. This was something hunting them specifically. The mujahideen had never been able to do this. Their anti-aircraft capability had been a joke. The SA-7 missiles they'd captured or received from China were old, unreliable, easy to fool with flares or evasive maneuvers. A pilot who knew what he was doing could survive dozens of SA-7 launches. The numbers started climbing. 3 helicopters in a week. 5 the week after. Then 8. Each loss followed the same pattern. A flash from the ground, too fast to track. No smoke trail visible until after the launch. The missile streaking upward at speeds that made countermeasures useless. And then the explosion, precise and catastrophic. The fear wasn't just in the losses. It was in how it happened. There was no warning. No tracer fire arcing up from the ground. No time to deploy countermeasures or take evasive action. Just a streak too fast to track, and then the explosion. The old missiles gave pilots a chance. You could see them coming, watch the smoke trail, turn into it or deploy flares or dive for the deck. This new weapon gave them nothing. It launched, it tracked, it killed. Pilots who'd flown hundreds of missions, who'd survived years of combat, started refusing orders. A captain with 300 hours over Afghanistan told his commander he wouldn't fly. "Court-martial me if you want," he said, "but I'm not taking that machine up to die for nothing." He wasn't alone. Others flew but stayed high, too high to be effective, circling uselessly at 3,000 or 4,000 meters while the convoys below took fire. The entire tactical advantage the helicopters provided began to collapse. Ground commanders were furious. They'd planned operations around air support. Entire strategies depended on the helicopters being able to suppress enemy positions, extract wounded soldiers, deliver reinforcements to firefights. Now the pilots were refusing to descend below altitudes where they could actually help. Convoys that had moved with confidence, knowing air cover was minutes away, now crawled through valleys in terror. Ambushes that would have been broken up by a single gunship run now played out to their bloody conclusion. The anger went both ways. Pilots pointed out that they were being sent to die in machines that offered no protection against this new threat. Ground troops accused them of cowardice, of abandoning soldiers under fire. Fistfights broke out in base canteens. The cohesion that had held the Soviet forces together despite 7 years of grinding warfare started to fracture. Soviet intelligence worked frantically to understand what was happening. They collected wreckage from crash sites, photographed the shrapnel patterns, analyzed the guidance systems they managed to recover. The evidence was undeniable. This was a missile, something guided, something sophisticated. The seeker head fragments they found contained components that didn't exist in Soviet or Chinese inventories. American components. The missiles were American. But the mujahideen weren't supposed to have anything like this. The CIA had been arming them since the war began, everyone knew that, but carefully, always with deniability in mind. Kalashnikovs were fine. They were Soviet designs anyway, easy to claim they'd been captured. Mortars were acceptable. Old Chinese rockets, Soviet equipment sold on the black market, that was all within the rules of the game both superpowers had been playing since the war started. But introducing American technology, something that could be traced directly back to Washington, something this advanced, that was a line the Kremlin assumed the Americans wouldn't cross. They'd assumed wrong. The Stinger missile had been in development since the 1970s. It was designed to solve a problem that had plagued infantry forces since aircraft became a battlefield threat. How do you give a single soldier the ability to destroy a fast-moving aircraft without requiring a truck full of equipment or a team of specialists? The answer was a fire-and-forget system. A soldier could carry it, aim it at an aircraft, pull the trigger, and then forget about it. The missile would do the rest. Its infrared seeker locked onto engine heat and tracked the target with a precision that made evasion nearly impossible. The technology was revolutionary. Earlier man-portable systems required the operator to keep the target in sight, manually guiding the missile or maintaining a radar lock. The Stinger needed none of that. Once launched, its seeker took over. It calculated intercept courses, adjusted for target movement, ignored decoys. It was specifically designed to counter the exact countermeasures Soviet helicopters carried. Flares burned too cool. Chaff didn't emit heat. Evasive maneuvers just delayed the inevitable. For years, the CIA had resisted introducing stingers into Afghanistan. The risk was enormous. If a missile fell into Soviet hands intact, they could reverse engineer it, develop countermeasures, neutralize the American advantage. If serial numbers were traced back to American factories, it would be proof of direct U.S. involvement in the war, something both superpowers had carefully avoided acknowledging. The fiction that this was an Afghan conflict, not a superpower proxy war, would collapse. But by 1985, the calculus had changed. The war was stalemated. The Soviets controlled the cities, but couldn't pacify the countryside. The mujahideen controlled vast swaths of territory, but couldn't dislodge Soviet forces from their bases. Hundreds of thousands were dead. Millions had fled to Pakistan and Iran. The humanitarian catastrophe was immense, but strategically, nothing was moving. The CIA believed a single asymmetric advantage could break the stalemate. Something the Soviets couldn't counter. Something that would make their occupation unsustainable. In April 1986, the first shipment arrived in Pakistan. 200 missiles, packed in crates marked as agricultural equipment, transported overland from Karachi to Peshawar. CIA officers met with selected mujahideen commanders in safe houses across the border. The training was intensive. The officers demonstrated how to operate the weapons, how to position themselves for maximum effectiveness, how to calculate lead time and firing angles. They emphasized operational security. Every missile was numbered. Every launch had to be accounted for. The mujahideen were instructed to recover the launchers after firing, to leave no evidence that could be photographed or analyzed. The commanders chosen for the first weapons were carefully vetted. The CIA wanted men who could be trusted to follow instructions, who understood the importance of secrecy, who had the tactical sense to use the missiles effectively. They selected leaders from different mujahideen factions, distributing the weapons to ensure no single group gained too much power. The internal politics of the resistance were complicated, fractured along ethnic and ideological lines. The CIA navigated this carefully, using the stingers as leverage to encourage cooperation. The first successful engagement happened in late September. A mujahideen team positioned itself on a ridge overlooking the Kabul-Jalalabad highway. They'd received intelligence that a convoy would pass that morning, escorted by Mi-24 gunships. 3 men carried the Stinger launchers. They waited in positions they'd scouted days earlier, concealed among rocks, with clear sight lines to the valley below. The helicopters appeared exactly when expected, flying low along the road, their door gunners scanning for threats. The mujahideen waited until they were in range, then fired all 3 missiles in rapid succession. The first missile streaked upward, its seeker locking onto the lead helicopter's exhaust. The explosion tore through the engine compartment. The helicopter rolled sideways and crashed into the hillside, the fireball visible for miles. The second missile struck the wingman before the pilot could react. The third missed, its target having already begun evasive maneuvers, but the damage was done. 2 helicopters destroyed in less than 30 seconds. Word spread fast. Among the mujahideen, the Stinger became legendary almost immediately. Fighters who'd spent years hiding from helicopters, who'd watched helplessly as their positions were bombed, suddenly had a weapon that could fight back. Morale sorda. Recruitment increased. The psychological shift was profound. They weren't just resisting anymore. They were winning. Among Soviet forces, the opposite happened. The panic was immediate. Pilots who heard about the Kabul-Jalalabad ambush demanded answers. What had killed those helicopters? Was it just those 2, or were more crews at risk? Command had no good answers. They didn't know how many missiles the mujahideen had. They didn't know where they'd come from. They didn't know how to stop them. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. By October, Soviet helicopter losses had quadrupled. Flight patterns changed overnight. Pilots refused to fly below 3,000 meters, rendering them ineffective for ground support. From that altitude, they couldn't identify targets, couldn't provide accurate fire support, couldn't respond quickly to troops in contact. Commanders who'd relied on air superiority to move troops and supplies found themselves pinned down, unable to maneuver. Entire operations were cancelled because the helicopters couldn't be risked. The psychological impact was worse than the material losses. Soviet helicopter production could replace the lost aircraft. pilot training programs could replace lost crews, though it took time. But the fear couldn't be managed. The pilots had gone from predators to prey. Every mission became a calculation of risk versus necessity. Every flight was a gamble. The confidence that had defined Soviet air operations for 7 years evaporated. Soviet command tried everything. They equipped helicopters with flare dispensers, metallic chaff, infrared jammers. Engineers worked around the clock to develop countermeasures. The flares were upgraded, designed to burn hotter, last longer, create larger heat signatures. Helicopters were outfitted with decoy launchers that could fire dozens of flares in sequence, flooding the area with false targets. None of it worked consistently. The Stinger seeker was too sophisticated, its tracking algorithm designed specifically to ignore decoys. It could distinguish between the sustained heat of an engine and the brief flare of a countermeasure. They tried flying in pairs, hoping one aircraft could draw fire while the other escaped. The mujahideen adapted, firing 2 missiles simultaneously. They tried night operations, thinking darkness would confuse the infrared guidance. It didn't. The engine heat was just as visible at night, perhaps more so against the cold mountain air. They tried flying nap of the earth, staying below ridgelines, using terrain to mask their approach. This worked sometimes, but it was exhausting, dangerous, and limited their effectiveness even further. Desperation led to stranger measures. Some units painted their helicopters with heat-dispersing coatings, trying to reduce infrared signatures. It made marginal difference at best. Others experimented with flying with engines at reduced power, sacrificing performance for stealth. This made the helicopters vulnerable to ground fire and limited their combat capability. A few commanders suggested simply abandoning helicopter operations entirely, relying on fixed-wing aircraft flying at higher altitudes. But fixed-wing aircraft couldn't provide the same close support, couldn't land in small clearings to extract wounded, couldn't hover to suppress an ambush. The panic spread beyond the pilots. Ground troops who depended on air support for extraction and resupply realized they were now isolated. A patrol that ran into trouble 20 kilometers from base used to call for helicopter backup. Now they were on their own. Medical evacuations that had saved countless lives became gambles. A pilot had to decide if flying into a hot landing zone to extract wounded soldiers was worth the risk of a Stinger missile. Sometimes they decided it wasn't. Convoys that had moved freely with helicopter escorts now faced ambushes they couldn't survive. The mujahideen adjusted their tactics immediately. They'd position Stinger teams on high ground overlooking roads, then hit convoys with rocket-propelled grenades and heavy machine guns. When the convoy called for air support, the helicopters would arrive and the Stingers would fire. It was devastatingly effective. Entire convoys were destroyed. The casualties mounted. Morale, already fragile after years of inconclusive fighting, cracked. Soldiers started questioning why they were there, what they were dying for, whether the war could even be won. Letters home became darker. Mothers in Moscow and Leningrad received word that their sons had died in helicopter crashes, in ambushes, in accidents that weren't accidents. The official casualty figures were lies, everyone knew it. The real numbers were much higher. In Moscow, the reports landed on desks where the implications were understood immediately. This wasn't just about helicopters. The Stinger represented something larger. It was proof that the Americans were willing to escalate, willing to introduce advanced weapons directly into the conflict. And if they were willing to do that, what else might they provide? Anti-tank missiles? Surface-to-air systems capable of targeting high-altitude aircraft? The war that had seemed manageable, a costly but sustainable effort to maintain influence in Central Asia, suddenly looked unwinnable. The Politburo meetings grew tense. Hardliners argued for escalation, for matching American involvement with increased Soviet commitment. Others, quieter voices growing louder, suggested withdrawal. Afghanistan was bleeding the Soviet Union. Economically, it was a disaster. Militarily, it was a quagmire. Politically, it was poison. The younger generation saw it as their Vietnam, a meaningless war fought for unclear objectives at tremendous cost. The decision to withdraw wasn't made in a single moment. It was a process, a slow recognition that the cost had become too high. But the Stinger missile accelerated that process. It removed the Soviet advantage in the one area where they'd been dominant. It shifted the balance in a way that no amount of troops or tanks could reverse. Air superiority had been the foundation of Soviet strategy. Without it, the war became unsustainable. By 1989, the last Soviet forces crossed back over the border. The helicopters that had once ruled the Afghan sky were gone, withdrawn to bases in Central Asia where they'd never fly combat missions again. The pilots who survived carried the memory of those months in 1986, when the ground below them had stopped being a place they controlled and became a place that could kill them without warning. They'd faced an invisible enemy, a weapon they couldn't see until it was too late, and it had broken them. The CIA never officially acknowledged the program. The Stinger missiles were never supposed to leave a trace. But everyone involved understood what had happened. A small number of weapons, delivered at the right moment, had altered the course of a superpower conflict. The ghost weapon that created mass panic wasn't a ghost at all. It was real, and it had worked exactly as intended. The war's end didn't bring peace. Afghanistan descended into civil war, the mujahideen factions turning on each other with the same ferocity they'd shown against the Soviets. The Stingers disappeared into the chaos, some destroyed, some sold on black markets, some retained by commanders who would later become warlords. The CIA's careful accounting system collapsed. The weapons they'd introduced to end one war became tools in countless others. But in those specific months of 1986, when Soviet helicopters fell from the sky and pilots refused to fly and ground troops realized they were alone, the Stinger had done exactly what it was meant to do. It had changed everything. And everyone who'd been there on both sides knew they'd witnessed the moment when the war became unwinnable.